is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories. Elon Musk polls Twitter users on whether he should step down as CEO and is voted out. Hopeful signs for China's economy as Beijing vows to help boost private companies. A historic deal to protect nature by 2030 is reached at the COP15 UN Biodiversity Summit in Montreal. He finally did it. Messi and Argentina celebrate winning the World Cup, defeating France in perhaps the greatest final of all time.
For me, building bridges is a natural thing because I love both countries.
And meeting the bridge builders, how one town planner is transforming modern living with Chinese and British philosophies. A majority of Twitter users who voted said Elon Musk should step down as CEO after the billionaire ran an online poll asking whether he should resign. More than half of the 17.5 million people who took part said yes. Musk bought Twitter in October for $44 billion. Before the poll closed, he said he would abide by the results. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett, who's in New York, at the Stock Exchange. Good to see you, John. Now, Musk knows he's not very popular right now, doesn't he?
No. The thing is, does it matter? That's the thing. I mean, if you're the richest man, who cares if people don't like you? But yeah, you're right, he does know. And he got it right between the eyes in the past 24 hours. Because what happened was he sent out one of those Twitter surveys, which he's rather fond of since taking over the company. And the survey basically said, do you think I should stay on as CEO of Twitter? Well, the results of that were deafening for Elon Musk and everybody else, because 58% of the respondents said, no way, Jose, you should go and get back to Tesla. Of course, they didn't actually say that. They voted no by putting a cross or whatever it was they did. Anyway, it was a whopping 58% of respondents. And that amounts to about 17 million people around the world who said, look, you need to get off this site and leave it to somebody that knows better than you. The question is, of course, will he go? And I think that he will. And I've said this on our program several times in the past couple of months. I think that the idea behind this, I mean, leave out all the noise that there is around it. Just see it from his point of view. He paid $44 billion. He's got it now. It's not going to go away. I think the most sensible thing, and I think the plan all along, was to appoint somebody who is a bit more savvy when it comes to social media to run the site. So, yes, I think that will happen. And we had an inkling of this last week because Goldman Sachs, which, as you know, is a leading Wall Street investment bank, said to him last week, you've got to go. You've got to get back to Tesla. And the reason for that is that the Tesla share price has literally fallen off a cliff. Since he began flirting with the idea of buying Twitter, and then since he actually got it in the autumn, in the Northern Hemisphere anyway, in the autumn. And basically, the share price has tumbled, and people are very upset about this. Now, Tesla is a great company. It'll probably come back over time, but people worry when they see the share price down quite so much. So he's been told, you've got to move on, and I think he will. But I don't think it'll happen until the early part of this coming year, 2023. He also says this is the end of surveys. No more, how do I run Twitter surveys? This apparently is the last one. So we'll see whether that's true or not. Juliet?
Well, I hope this isn't the end of you and me talking about the rise and fall of Elon Musk, of Twitter and all of that. But let's talk about another epic saga, FTX and developments there.
Yes. Well, this is the big story of the hour. I mean, this is literally still breaking here in North America. And Sam Bankman-Fried, who was the CEO of FTX, the second largest cryptocurrency exchange, you know the story now. The company collapsed a couple of weeks ago. Both of his companies were based in the Bahamas. He's been in the Bahamas, and then last week he was taken into custody in a rat-infested, we are told, Bahamian jail. And he's just appeared in court in the Bahamas, where he has agreed not to fight extradition. Now, the thing about Sam Bankman-Fried is he has a lot to say for himself, and I think his lawyers would rather he didn't say some of these things, but he has said them, and I dare say he'll go on saying it. One of the things he said was, I'm going to fight extradition to the United States. Well, today in court he said that he wouldn't fight extradition to the United States, so now he will be extradited, and I think that they're going to bring him here to New York. I believe so. We'll see if that happens. The thing about FTX is it collapsed with a $32 billion hole in the company. $8 to $9 billion of customers' money has completely disappeared. And a little sidebar to this story. Over the weekend, including on National Public Radio here in America, there was a very big story about Binance, which is the Chinese-backed company run by a Canadian Chineseman called, I can't pronounce his name, so we call him CZ for short. And he runs Binance, which is the biggest cryptocurrency exchange, you know, where you go to exchange your dollars and your yuan and your yen and your euros for cryptocurrency. And there was real questions being asked over the weekend about the validity of the finances of Binance. Well, today, in the last hour, Binance has just bought for $1.2 billion the lending platform that went bust in May called Voyager. And this is assuaging concerns that there's a problem, as there was with FTX, like Binance. So that's quite a bit of strong news if you are a cryptocurrency supporter.
John, I need to ask you, it's the last full trading week of the year. Is there going to be a Santa rally?
Well, there normally is, has to be said. This seems to be a bit of a trend here. There often is. The problem this year is that Wall Street is literally at war, you know, daggers drawn, basically, with the Federal Reserve. Because, as you know, the Federal Reserve is determined to fight inflation, to get it down to about 2% from the 8%, 7% it currently is now. That's going to take them until 2023, 24, even potentially 25. And Wall Street feels that really, given all the data that's come in, that the Federal Reserve doesn't need to be as hawkish, as Americans say, as they are being. Last week, after the interest rate hike of 50 basis points, which was expected, we got very, very, very hawkish, you know, aggressive answering of questions by the chairman of the central bank, Jerome Powell. And Wall Street fears that they want a recession in order to really bring down inflation. That would be, in a sense, the best way. But, of course, it would hurt corporate profits, make their lending, their borrowing more expensive. There'd be many more layoffs, all that kind of thing. So Wall Street's kind of on edge at the moment. We have the markets, well, they're not doing too bad at the moment. The Dow is around 32,800. It's down, but only by 24 points. The Nasdaq's down a full 1%, and the S&P 500 down by 0.4%. I think, given everything that's been said, it might have been worse to begin the week. So we'll see what happens on Friday, whether it'll be a ho-ho-ho Christmas or not. I don't know.
John Terry, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much. Let's take a quick look now at what's happening on European markets at the start of this last full trading week of the year. And we'll start with the CAC in France. Up a tiny bit there. Up 0.45%. Let's move across to FTSE 100 in London. Similar kind of picture, up a nudge. It seems like we're really pretty much treading water. And let's head to Germany and to the DAX. Yeah, pretty much the same story across the board. You know, not much economic data out. Let's talk to Mark Oswald, who's the Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ATM Investor Services. Great to see you, as always, Mark. So it seems that the market's mood remains quite cautious.
The market's mood is naturally cautious. I think it's not just a question of the Federal Reserve, but also the ECB was extraordinarily hawkish and has drummed the message home again today. They don't know where interest rates are going to end up, but it's going to be higher than where markets thought they were going to go. And we've also got a lot of chatter going around the Bank of Japan exiting its super easy policy once Governor Kuroda retires. So the message there really is all the major central banks really seem to be unrelenting in this hawkish pressure. And it's very difficult, given an uncertain outlook, to really be fighting the Fed, fighting the ECB, even fighting the BOJ in the long run.
And it's looking like quite a quiet week when it comes to economic data, but there are a couple of things that we could be looking out for, aren't there?
Yes, most importantly, probably at the end of the week, the PCE deflators in the US. This is the Federal Reserve's preferred measure of inflation. They are expected to come down to 5.7, 5.6 and 4.7 respectively on the core measure. That's still a very long way away. And I think the big tussle here that markets have is they need to always remember that if the inflation rates went down towards 3%, that's not really good enough for any of these central banks who all have a target around 2%. It doesn't matter whether it's an average or not. And it may be the case that with inflation, the inflation that we have, A, we're going to have food price pressures next year. B, in terms of the euro area, people need to remember that if the energy prices start coming down, so will the government subsidies. So the benefits to consumers and the benefits in terms of inflation indices is going to be actually quite minimal. There is that nagging doubt in the background, and obviously we've also got this prospect of corporate earnings in terms of profits being quite severely impaired next year.
So I think I know the answer to this next question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Are recession fears going to continue to cast a shadow then, or will we get that Santa rally in Europe?
No, I think recession fears are very much continuing to cast a long shadow. And the problematic is when we get to year end, it's all about people rebalancing their portfolios. And at the moment, the natural thing really to do is probably rebalance away from the equity markets. There are estimates, I think, from JP Morgan suggesting that there may be 100 billion of equities in the US to be sold before year end. That's not a huge amount in the bigger scheme of things, but it just creates that imbalance that's likely to sit like a very wet blanket on top of these equity markets.
Well, Mark Cotswell, wet blanket or not, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Beijing signals a focus on getting the economy back on track with plans to boost domestic consumption and investment. I talked to Yao Yang, director of the China Center for Economic Research. He's also the dean of the National School of Development at Peking University. And I asked where the best place to start is as COVID cases rise.
Well, the best to start is actually the opening up itself, right? So China has greatly loosened its COVID policy, and now the whole society is being open. And I believe in most cities, by the end of January, this round of COVID is going to subdue. And that's probably the best opportunity for China to focus on economic growth again. Adding on the government policy to boost the consumption, I have confidence that next year's growth is going to be good for China.
That's looking ahead, but what about what's happening now? Because with the wave of COVID-19, that's going to affect the economy.
Yes. For this month, the growth is not going to look very good. But I think that's the necessary price we have to pay. I think this is also happened in other countries when they just opened up. I think the government is quite determined this time to open up the society. And we can see throughout the country, people are quite calm. Of course, there are severe cases, but the number of severe cases is quite limited. And hospital resources are just enough to take care of those severe cases. After some initial anxiety, people are becoming much calmer than before. So I believe that by the time of Spring Festival, the society is going to go back to normal.
What do you think all of this means then for investors?
Usually investors and also those China watchers always want to project the Chinese economy based on short-term performance of the economy. But next year, I do believe that Chinese economy is going to go back on its normal growth trajectory. China's potential growth rate is still around 5.5 to 6%. Right? So if investors want to invest in China, next year will be a good time for them to do that. I mean, even in this year, we still see foreign direct investment going into China was increased. Next year, I can expect more investment flowing into China.
Coming up on Global Business Europe, a historic deal to protect nature by 2030 is reached at the COP15 UN Biodiversity Summit in Montreal.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliette Mann. Welcome back. Remember, CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And here in the UK, we're available 24 hours a day on Freeview. A historic breakthrough at the COP15 UN Biodiversity Summit in Montreal. Delegates agreed to protect 1/3 of the world's land and oceans by the end of 2030. Edith Tianshan is in Montreal. Edith, getting all countries on board is quite a challenge. So how did that happen? And give us some of the detail on what they have agreed on. I know it's a very big document.
Well, indeed, but to give you in a nutshell, I mean, this was quite surprising because essentially the delegations had all the way until the end of Monday, midnight. So they had all day today to actually flesh out all the, the sticking issues. But instead, in a surprising breakthrough, it was on Sunday night, that plenary session that went on until 3:30 a.m. local time. That's when they were able to agree on a final framework agreement. And we understand that's largely because of a new text that was distributed by China, the COP15 presidency, to all the delegations. And we understand there was a lot of language that the countries could finally agree on. But what really mattered at the end of the day is that, as you mentioned, there are a lot of items on this. There's roughly 23 targets that they have in this agreement. But some of the central goals is really what matters here, and that is the catchphrase we've been talking about since the beginning, the 30 by 30 target. That's finally in this agreement. That is to preserve, to protect at least 30% of the world's land and waters by 2030. That's a big goal. And secondly, they would like to also reform nearly $500 billion instead of investing them as government subsidies into environmentally harmful agents. They aim to raise all of that money for conservation projects. That's another important breakthrough. And finally, there's another important item, and that has to do with the restoration of places that have already been degraded. We're talking about some 30% of wetland, inland, marine ecosystems that have been disproportionately impacted by us humans that will now be put under restoration projects. So just these highlights alone are extremely significant. We've also heard from the co-host country, the Canadian Minister of Environment, Stephen Guilbeault, who said that this Kunming-Montreal Pact is essentially a bold step forward to protect nature. And he also talked about how much of a breakthrough this was, given the fact that only about 6 months ago we didn't even know if we were going to hold this summit at all. And this whole past 2 weeks we've been following it, there was a lot of optimism, but it was cautious. We didn't even know if there could be an agreement at the end of the day, and yet here we have it finally. The good thing is that although there is no legally binding document, this is just a framework agreement, these countries will now go back to their capital cities and they will set their own conservation targets. But at the end of the day, by this agreement, they will be required to continue to monitor and share the progress they make on the ground.
Edith Chanshan in Montreal, thank you for that update. EU ministers have reached a long-awaited deal on a gas price cap. The 27 member states have been divided for months over the emergency measure, which aims to reduce energy bills that have soared due to Russia's war in Ukraine. Our correspondent Rosie Berchard is in Brussels. Rosie, what more do we know?
Well, some diplomats calling this a Christmas miracle because, as you said, after months of wrangling and disagreement, I can now confirm that EU countries have reached at least a political agreement to cap gas prices. Now, that means that the formal adoption and the legal votes on this legislation will go through over the next coming days, according to expectations. And what's at least the word on the street here in Brussels is that the cap will be set at 180 euros per megawatt hour. That is with reference to prices on the main gas exchange here in Europe, which is the Dutch title transfer facility. Now, all this might seem quite technical, but this really will be seen by many as a climb down from those countries that did not want to cap gas prices, because the original proposal that ministers were debating was to cap prices at around 275 euros per megawatt hour. So we're seeing quite a lower cap than some had expected, and I think probably than some pro-cap countries had even dared to hope for. Just to give you a bit of the background here, the EU for this year, throughout 2022, has been embroiled in an energy crisis. The bloc has been racing to try and diversify away from reliance on Russia for natural gas imports. They have managed to strike new deals, for example, with the US, with Norway, and they've also been looking at cutting gas consumption to try and drive down demand overall. Now it looks like they will have a fresh tool in their toolbox to try and tackle this energy crisis, which rumbles on as we reach really the depths of midwinter here in Europe.
Rosie Berchard in Brussels, thank you. Still ahead. Sending asylum seekers to Rwanda for processing is legal. Victory for the British government after a court rules in favour of its controversial plan.
Roger,
we can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we try to save the world.
Awesome!
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But
When the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with me, Juliet Mann. The headlines again. Elon Musk polls Twitter users on whether he should step down as CEO and is voted out. Hopeful signs for China's economy as Beijing vows to help boost private companies. And a historic deal to protect nature by 2030 is reached at the COP15 UN Biodiversity Summit in Montreal. Ukraine says it has shot down more than a dozen Iranian drones over Kyiv as Russia continues the most intense bombardment of the capital seen since the start of the conflict. The attack comes as President Putin arrives in Belarus. There's speculation Moscow is planning a ground offensive on Ukraine's northern border. Louise Greenwood reports.
Kiev early on Monday morning. The city's residents awoke to a barrage of kamikaze drone attacks in Moscow's third major air offensive on the city in less than a week.
It banged again, but this time so hard that the walls shook, and I saw the flames. From my window it looked like it was above the 5th floor. I live on the 4th floor, but it was visible that the flames were higher than these houses.
The authorities say 18 out of 23 drones were intercepted before they could land and explode on impact. Nicknamed mopeds because of the buzzing sound made by their motors, Ukraine's military claims the unmanned devices are once again Iranian-made Shahed drones, launched from the eastern coast of the Crimean Peninsula, which fell to Moscow's control in 2014.
I heard the sound of the moped and I looked. There was this glow going on and then the drone itself. And then 30 seconds later there was a big explosion and that was it.
Meanwhile, on the front line in the eastern Donbass region, Ukraine claims that civilian infrastructure had been targeted in the heavily contested city of Bakhmut. While in the southern city of Kherson, where Russian troops were ousted last month, the regional governor claims artillery, rocket and mortar fire over the weekend had left 3 dead. In Latvia, the leaders of the Western-backed Joint Expeditionary Force have been meeting to discuss more support for Ukraine as the conflict grinds on.
I think the first is ensuring that we deliver more military aid and that military aid evolves to meet the situation that we're now facing. And that means more air defence systems, it means artillery, it means armoured vehicles.
Monday also sees the first trip by Russia's President Putin to Ukraine's neighbour, Belarus, in more than 3 years. Moscow and Minsk have set up joint military units in Belarus, where last week 3 Russian warplanes were deployed. Meanwhile, as the bombardment continues, ordinary Ukrainians appear determined to continue with life as normally as they can, with Kiev's Jewish community meeting to celebrate the annual Hanukkah festival on the city's Independence Square.
That's it. I say to Ukrainian people every day, we are the light, and we push a lot of darkness.
But with Ukraine again warning that a major ground offensive is being planned by Moscow in the new year, the question for Kiev is now where and when the next attack will come. Louise Greenwood, CGTN.
Meanwhile, as Putin arrives in Belarus, it's been announced that Russian troops in the country are to hold tactical exercises. The Defence Ministry in Moscow says it should give a final assessment of their combat readiness. Dasa Cherishova reports.
Yes, indeed. We've heard from the Russian media quoting the Russian Defense Ministry this morning that there will be exercises of the tactical battalion exercises of the regional grouping of forces that has been deployed in Belarus. Now, remember, Russia has sent up to 9,000 military to Belarus as part of its regional grouping of forces down there. Now, according to the Defense Ministry, which actually did not specify when and where the drills will be taking place in Belarus, these will give the final assessment of the unit's combat capability and combat readiness. Very interestingly, before the meeting between the two presidents in Minsk, there was another meeting between the defense ministers of these two countries, and we understand the sides have been talking about the cooperation in the security area. Having said that, you have to remember that Belarus for months been saying that it has no intention to get involved in what is described as Russia's special military operation in Ukraine.
The British government has welcomed a High Court ruling that its plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda to have their claims considered is lawful. In a victory for the government, the judges ruled that the controversial policy was consistent with the Refugee Convention and with human rights law. The scheme was announced in April by then Home Secretary Priti Patel in a bid to deter people crossing the Channel from France in small boats. However, a flight planned for June was eventually cancelled after multiple legal challenges. CGTN's Catherine Drew has been following the story. Catherine, can you tell us any more about this ruling?
Yes, well, it's a welcome victory for the government. Had it gone against the government, it would have been a major blow to this policy. And let's face it, as you've just detailed, the launch of this policy was a debacle in the first place. There's going to be a flight, there isn't going to be a flight. It was on and off. This has been welcomed by former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Priti Patel, former Home Secretary. They, of course, are the pair that launched this. Rishi Sunak, though, the current Prime Minister, also saying that it is common sense, that he's going to tackle this small boats crisis and it will save lives. Now, last week we had a reminder of why they launched this policy. We had a major operation between French and British rescue teams in the Channel because 4 people died and multiple people were rescued in these small boats trying to make this very dangerous crossing from France very, very dangerous. Now, Suella Braverman, the current Interior Minister, she's been in the House of Commons just in the past hour saying that she welcomes this decision. Let's take a listen.
I won't apologise for telling the truth about the scale of the challenge that we are facing when it comes to illegal migration, and I will also reiterate my absolute commitment to delivering upon the groundbreaking agreement that we have with Rwanda. It is compassionate, it is pragmatic, and I invite the opposition parties to support it.
Now, Juliet, charities and NGOs have argued against this and say they will continue to do so. In the court case, they had argued that Rwanda is not a safe country to send these people, many of whom will, of course, be traumatised by what they've been through, and it has a questionable human rights record. Now, let's take a listen to the representative of the union that represents Border Force staff. They have been part of this legal action against the policy. Let's hear what they've had to say.
We were clear right from the outset that our members didn't want to carry out this policy on a basis they thought it was unlawful, morally reprehensible and utterly inhumane. The judges today may well have found that decision to be lawful, but it remains morally reprehensible and utterly inhumane, and we will continue to do all we can to fight this policy all the way.
But Catherine, it's not all gone the government's way, has it?
No, it hasn't. This legal case was in 2 parts. The first part, was it lawful? The judges have answered that question for now. Yes, it was. But the High Court also said that the Home Office should have considered that they did not properly consider the personal circumstances of the 8 people that were due on that flight to Rwanda in June, the flight that got cancelled. Those cases have been sent back to the Home Office, and that may have some legal ramifications for future cases. Meanwhile, the judges have said that in mid-January they will announce whether they will allow an appeal. If they do, I think we can expect a whole multiple of appeals between these various groups that have been opposing this legislation. Campaigners say it's cruel, ineffective and a waste of money. Let's remind ourselves that the British government has paid Rwanda $170 million. So far, not one person has been sent to Rwanda. So that's an awful lot of money for a scheme that clearly hasn't got off the ground. Of course, that could change in 2023, but we're going to see a lot of legal action before then. Juliet.
Certainly will. Catherine Drew, thank you very much. China reported 2 COVID-related deaths on Monday, the first official cases since the start of December. The new daily case count has come down. A top Chinese health official says this wave of infections could run until mid-January before the Lunar New Year. The Thai Navy says 31 sailors are still missing after a vessel sank on Sunday during a storm in the Gulf of Thailand. It was carrying more than 100 people when it went down after taking on water, which flooded its hull and short-circuited its engine room. Rescue efforts continue. There'll be an investigation into the cause of the disaster. Peru's president will replace the country's prime minister as part of a reshuffle of her cabinet. Pedro Angulo has been in his role for just a week. Dina Boluarte, who was vice president until earlier this month when her predecessor was removed from office, says she's leading a transition government. Her administration has been rocked by political turbulence and widespread protests that have left dozens dead. Argentina are world champions. They beat France 4-2 on penalties after an incredible game which finished 3-3 after extra time. The players paraded the trophy on an open-top bus through Doha after the match. The team's captain, Lionel Messi, scored twice in the game and finally got his hands on the one trophy that had been missing from his glittering collection. He also won the Golden Ball for Player of the Tournament. And this is how much it meant back home. Fans celebrated into the night in Buenos Aires and across Argentina. It was their first World Cup win since 1986 and their third World Cup trophy overall. There was a very different mood in Paris after fans saw their team draw level from 2-0 down and then equalise again in extra time, only to suffer heartbreak in the shootout. Star Kylian Mbappe was inconsolable after the match. He did become, though, only the second player ever to score a hat-trick in a World Cup final, and the first since 1966. But it wasn't enough. Associated Press correspondent Philip Crowther spent the day in Doha's main marketplace, where many fans gathered after the final to celebrate the result. He sent this report.
Well, it's a very quiet evening here in Doha. A lot of the fans have now disappeared from here. A few Argentinian fans still walking around the Souk Waqif. You can see behind me, some of them possibly hungover, a lot of them coming to terms with what they saw around 24 hours ago, coming to terms with this incredible moment for them in Argentinian history, and what is currently already being deemed maybe the best final of a football World Cup of all time, and the discussion now also open as to whether that game, that final between Argentina and France, is one of the best football matches of all time. For the organisers here, it couldn't really have come much better for the Qatari authorities, for FIFA as well, for this to be a final between Argentina and France, between Lionel Messi, his swan song on this World Cup stage, and for someone like Kylian Mbappe, the new generation of superstars, to come up against Lionel Messi on the biggest stage. Both of them, of course, play for Paris Saint-Germain. Both of them are paid Qatari money on a weekly basis. Now, what the Argentina team is doing right now is they are flying home. They left Qatar pretty much as quickly as they possibly could to start their very, very long journey home to a hero's welcome. Of course, in Buenos Aires, we've all seen those scenes of celebration already. More of those await the Argentinian heroes, and more than anybody, Lionel Messi, of course, the hero of every Argentinian football fan right now. And after that, well, there's a reminder for us that the football season in Europe is still very much underway, that this was just a short hiatus, and that all of these players that you saw in the World Cup, well, you'll see them playing for their teams again very, very soon indeed. In Doha, Philip Crowther with the Associated Press for CGTN.
Our correspondent Joel Richards is in Buenos Aires. Joel, a dream come true for Messi and, of course, for the Argentinian team and the whole of Argentina. Celebrations still going on?
There's a quiet after the storm. Just at the moment, perhaps the adrenaline that everyone experienced yesterday has faded slightly after those historic celebrations. It's estimated that over 1 million people flooded the streets here in the heart of Buenos Aires, surrounding the obelisk, which I have behind me, this iconic monument in the heart of Buenos Aires. And as we said, the next day everyone's just reflecting on what was a historic day for the country, a historic day for Lionel Messi, and those two things really come together, because we spoke to a lot of supporters after the match ended yesterday, the dramatic finale with a penalty shootout, and what many people were saying is just how much it meant to them on a personal level, how many people thought about what they've been through the pandemic, what they've been through with the economic crisis that Argentina is going through, but also they thought about what it meant for Lionel Messi, this footballer that they've enjoyed over the last nearly 2 decades, and who really only had the World Cup to win as the last thing he needed to achieve that he hadn't achieved yet in his career. So really this victory brought everyone together. Let's hear from some of the supporters that I was able to speak to yesterday out here in Buenos Aires.
something we have been waiting for many, many years, and finally to get to this point and winning the World Cup, it's amazing for us.
You never will see the people of Argentina unite like this.
This means everything. This means everything. We are so happy, and we know we could do it. So this is amazing.
I want to tell Messi that I love him. I love the selección. I love Scaloni. I love all the world. And all the world. We are champions.
Joel, what kind of welcome can the Argentine team expect?
Well, there's a few things we do know, a few things we don't. We know that the team are due to arrive in the small hours of Tuesday morning. To give viewers an idea, it's just past 1:30 here in Buenos Aires. They're due to arrive around 1, 2 in the morning tomorrow. They'll go straight to the Argentine Football Association complex, which is right next to the international airport outside Buenos Aires. They'll sleep there, and then tomorrow there will be a victory procession to here at the obelisk in the centre of Buenos Aires. That is confirmed. We'll have the players on an open-top bus and everything that will come with that, which you can imagine after the scenes we saw on Sunday. Really, you have to expect something pretty similar, if not more, with the players bringing the trophy back to Argentina, back to Buenos Aires, to here at the obelisk. What we don't know and what is still being negotiated, it appears this will be a decision to be made by Messi and the players. That's whether or not they will then continue their journey to the obelisk, but then down a few blocks further, down to the Casa Rosada, which is the government house, and whether or not they will meet President Alberto Fernandez. That's something that's still very much in the air. We have conflicting reports about that will happen, and whether or not Lionel Messi would replicate not only winning the World Cup with Argentina in the same way that Diego Maradona did, but also then going to the Casa Rosada, coming out on the balcony in front of the iconic Plaza de Mayo, the Maze Square in the heart of Buenos Aires. So nonetheless, one thing then is for sure, we're going to have another party here. I'm sure we'll expect another similar amount of people on the streets as they welcome their heroes, led by Lionel Messi, to bring the World Cup, the third World Cup that Argentina have won, back and enjoy that triumph with Argentine supporters here.
Joel Richards in Buenos Aires, thank you very much. Qatar's hoping that the tournament will also leave a legacy off the pitch. Its World Cup organising chief says it will earn $17 billion in revenue. But that amount is far short of what the country spent on hosting. Now, some previous hosts, like South Africa, saw a dramatic increase in repeat tourism on the back of staging the event. But others argue that hosting is just an expensive vanity project. Well, Lisa Delphi-Nirotti is Director of Sport Management Programmes at George Washington University School of Business. Thanks ever so much for coming on the show. Let's look at the upside and the downside of hosting a World Cup, or indeed any major global sporting event. I mean, is it a win or an own goal?
You know, every country has their own objectives for hosting mega events. And I think actually Qatar took a page out of the China playbook. They hosted an excellent tournament. They branded the nation very well. Everywhere you looked, I was able to be at the tournament. It was beautiful. You know, you have the beautiful sky drops, the building wraps of players, street soccer-themed street displays. It was at night, it lit up like Disneyland. And, you know, it was just a wonderful display of both soccer and the country. And we have to understand this country is 51 years old. And so if they wanted to spend, you know, $220 billion on building up their country, building up the infrastructure, that's their choice. And so I really think it's up to each country and how they spend their money. And this is what they use their money on.
But of course, now the World Cup is over, those signs will come down, the lights will come down. It might not look like Disneyland for much longer. So what about these bespoke sporting venues that are built for the World Cup, that are built for events like the Olympics? Are they really sustainable?
Right. It's difficult to keep it sustained, but I must say, in Qatar's point, my first visit was in 1989, and there were camels in the street at that time. And I've had a chance to go back 10 other visits, and each time they built a new part of Qatar. You know, they had the Pearl, they had the Katara, they have different areas that they've built, and they've grown tourism over those years. So we have to think of this investment as a long-term investment. Are those buildings all filled? No, not right now, but their population has doubled, and they expect it to double again. So, you know, it's important for us to look at the long-term vision, and countries that host mega events with a long-term vision, they will do okay. Unfortunately, you know, Brazil, they had some legacy plans, but they weren't able to implement those due to financial situation and the downturn of the economy. Qatar has some legacy plans where they're planning to dismantle the 974 stadium, turn Education City into more of an education venue. So if Qatar does some of the things they say they're going to do for the long-term legacy, it could be a win. You know, hopefully those stadiums are not going to just sit there empty. Most of them, I think, will, but time will tell.
Lisa Delfini-Rotti at George Washington University School of Business, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, meet the bridge builders, how one town planner has been inspired by a combination of Chinese and British wisdom.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, in the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story, wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. Now, when you're queuing to pay for your Christmas shopping this year, remember to be polite to your cashier, as you could be looking at someone who will go on to run the biggest technology conference in the world in years to come. Ricardo Lima interviews hundreds of entrepreneurs who decide who should be invited to the annual Web Summit in Lisbon, and he told Global Business how his career began.
So my first job was working as a cashier in a supermarket during the Christmas break, and I absolutely hated that job. Because essentially people were the worst That's what I thought at the moment, because I was dealing with people and people were stressed because they wanted to do their Christmas shoppings, and there was like big queues, and when they got to me they were being really rude, so I absolutely didn't like that job. And what that essentially did was me starting to do other things and failing oftenly and trying different things until I started finding things that I really liked. And once I found those things, I started finding things that I was good at. And that is how I kind of like built my career until now.
Ricardo Lima, head of startups at the Web Summit, speaking to CGTN. And finally, we meet Wei Yang, a Chinese-British town planner who's broken many glass ceilings in her career. She was the first non-white president of the UK's Royal Town Planning Institute, and her philosophy was a combination of the UK's Garden City movement and the Chinese tradition of harmony. That's given rise to a reimagining of modern city living. Take a look.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the Icebreakers. Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dare to think beyond the horizon and open up our world.
I'm Wei Yang, and I was born in Beijing in 1974. My mother, she's a professor in university. My father, she's a teacher in a high school teaching Chinese. My father told me about the Chinese tradition. I was a big fan of Chinese culture. My mom, she told me more about mathematics and how we can protect the environment. I was very keen to go to Rome to study all the fascinating squares in Rome, but they didn't open degree courses for master students. So I applied Sheffield, because on their brochure they said, if you like countryside, you will like Sheffield. I was keen to be a great designer, thinking about the appearance of building. But actually, from the course, I learned about how we can design buildings to consider long-term sustainability. The Garden City movement started from social reform about a century ago. Industrialization happened mainly in major cities. There were a lot of rural communities. They moved to the urban area for job opportunities, but the city had a lot of slums because the living environment was very, very poor. Some pioneers, they started to think about how we can create a new model to resolve this problem. I think there are lots of initial great principles we can use, but 21st century we have different challenges like the climate change, like the biodiversity decline, and also we have the technology change as well. I developed that further to relate to the 21st century concept, so I call it 21st century garden cities. I wrote a book called Humanistic Pure Land and the Garden Cities. It's talking about the connections between garden cities and the Buddhism philosophy, because I believe compassion is the foundation why Garden City movement started in the first place. And also I believe Buddhism, which is very much a philosophy behind lots of people thinking in Chinese. So Tech City project was one of the first projects we got in London. At the time, the Tech City was a new concept, just started, and was around the Old Street roundabout. So rather than focus on the roundabout itself, we start to think about how we can develop Tech City around the Regent Canal, and then make sure that's the key focus of the whole area. When I first went back to China was around 2010. Sustainable development was still a very new thing. Before China opened up, there was a huge rural population. And then because of the very fast urban development and also economic development, a lot of rural population, they moved to urban areas. The Chinese large cities were the primary focus of urban development. A lot of mega cities like Beijing, Shanghai, quite often they are based on American models. But I believe Chinese has a rich culture. China is such a vast country, different provinces, and even between different villages, the culture can be very different. But how we can preserve this diversity and variety is so important. In 2013, I was the co-chair of UK-China Eco-Cities and Green Building Group. I went to China quite a lot to lead trade missions and also give lectures on sustainable development. China started the National Spatial Planning Reform, I think it was around 2018, and I was one of the experts to give advice to the Chinese ministry. So my recommendation was taken by the National Spatial Planning Reform to talk about how we can integrate the beauty of nature into urban development and how we can think about the better integrated urban-rural development. The Royal Town Planning Institute was formed in 1914. I became president in 2021. I was the first Chinese-British president in the institute, and I believe I was also one of the youngest of all the presidents as well. So I was very keen to lead the planning profession, to have a revival of spirit and modernize the planning profession. I'm very keen to engage young people and also to talk about how internationally we should have a more joined-up approach. All in all, a modernized planning profession is a profession for hope and for the future. It's a faith in our ability to act together. I think there are a lot both China and the UK can learn from each other. Chinese culture is my mother culture, so I always relate what I learned in England compared to what I experienced in China. UK has been doing fantastic in terms of thinking about sustainable development and also preserve the cultural heritage, like the model of national trust. One of the China's strengths is thinking strategically and then to consolidate all the efforts together to make things done. The Chinese culture is a very open culture, so Chinese people are quite willing to adapt to new technologies, so they have a quite open mind. I think actually that mindset helped me to think about how we can modernize the garden city concept to make sure it's related to the 21st century context. For me, building bridges is a natural thing because I love both countries. I think primarily people's concerns about happiness, health, and also friendship and how to contribute to society. There are lots of similarities. I would like to see in the next 30 years there are more collaborations between two countries to see how we can tackle the grand challenges. There is no age and gender difference in our spirit, no race difference in our soul. As long as we believe in ourselves, we can all make a lasting difference for good.
The headlines again. Elon Musk polls Twitter users on whether he should step down as CEO and is voted out. Hopeful signs for China's economy as Beijing vows to help boost private companies. And a historic deal to protect nature by 2030 is reached at the COP15 UN Biodiversity Summit in Montreal. Plus, he finally did it. Messi and Argentina celebrate winning the World Cup, defeating France in perhaps the greatest final of all time. That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching. There's more on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, 24 hours a day on Freeview. Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. But for now, from all the team here in London, goodbye.